Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us, and thank you for your patience. We seem to have a little electrical surge this morning, so the TV cameras weren't working, but everything's working now, as far as we know. We'd like to invite the student speaker, Cherie Aurora, from Richard Montgomery High School, to please come forward.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cherie Aurora, and I attend Richard Montgomery High School. And today I would like to focus on a historical educational reformer named Horace Mann. So Horace Mann lived from 1796 to 1859 and left a lasting impact on the American educational system. He was raised in poverty, and due to a barely functioning school system in Massachusetts, he was mainly self-taught. He then went on to Brown University and took an interest in social reform, politics, and education. After graduating, he practiced law and went on to serve as a delegate in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and later the state Senate as well. Now, at the time, the Massachusetts educational system was nowhere near what it could be, and the reform had begun. In 1837, the state created its first Board of Education, naming Mann as secretary. His goal was to raise the standard of his state's educational system and inform and educate more teachers. He began by starting a bi-weekly journal and lectured on education to all who would listen. So Horace Mann developed greatly influential principles that would go on to shape and raise the standard of the public education system throughout the country. He had 6 main principles that we can see today in all of our educational systems. They were: citizens cannot maintain both ignorance and freedom. This education should be paid for, controlled, and maintained by the public. This education should be provided in schools that embrace children from varying backgrounds. This education must be non-sectarian. This education must be taught using tenets of a free society, and this education must be provided by well-maintained professional teachers. These ideas went on to be widely adopted and change our public educational system for the better. So the reason that I wanted to speak about Horace Mann today was not only his great contribution to our educational system, but while I was researching him, I came across a quote that really stuck with me and I wanted to share. Horace Mann once said, "Do not think of knocking out another person's brains because he differs in opinion from you. It would be as rational to knock yourself on the head because you differ from yourself 10 years ago." Throughout my experience as an MCPS student, I have truly seen the impact of Horace Mann's work in the amazing way our county has incorporated his 6 principles in our school system. Being surrounded by students from so many different backgrounds and being taught by such knowledgeable teachers has given me an amazing educational experience. It has allowed me to explore myself as well as new ideas and opinions and interests while learning from the people around me. I've also been able to I've learned to be taught to acknowledge and respect other people's opinions and viewpoints, as said in the quote I just read, which has allowed me to broaden my horizons and stay open-minded. Montgomery County is the perfect example of how Horace Mann's work has influenced our country and how it can still be seen today. So as you go through this meeting today, keep this quote in mind. Our county is made up of such diverse backgrounds and points of view, and it is important to acknowledge all these opinions as they are so crucial and make this county the amazing one that it is. So I urge you to keep the wise words of Horace Mann in mind as you continue with your productive meeting today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cherie. You and Horace Mann educated us today, so we thank you. Next, we're going to have a few proclamations. We're going to have one extra from the listing here, but it's a proclamation. The first one is a proclamation recognizing Library Lovers Month by Councilmember Jawando.
Good morning, everybody. We're joined by our great director of the libraries, Anita Basalo, who will let say something in a moment. But Library Lovers Month, in case you didn't know, February has the honor of being both Black History Month and Library Lovers Month. I think it's a strong month, so we're really happy about that. And we just kicked it off in the library on Saturday at Connie Morella in Bethesda with a whole room of young students and their parents with a magic show that was really a math-based magic show. And I thought it was the perfect way to kick off the month. I'm in the midst of a 22-stop library tour, about halfway through, and we're highlighting all the great things that our libraries do. They're early child care and education centers. They're senior centers for many people. They help our folks experiencing homelessness. They help if you're looking for a job. They really do so many things in our community if you're looking to register to vote. And we're going to highlight that and have some sessions on that in the Education and Culture Committee this year. But really, at the end of the day, I want to tell you a story about this one 7-year-old girl when I was walking into Library Lovers Month. She was literally falling over herself with 2 bags of almost 30 books. And her mother came behind her picking up a few of them and said, yeah, we're in here every week. We're getting new books and returning them. We have one of the best library systems in the country. It can be even better for more people, and more people can have access. And I just want to thank Anita for all her great work. And I'll allow you to say a few words, and then I'll read the proclamation.
So I'd like to thank Council, particularly Councilmember Jawando, Council President Navarro, and everyone else who supports libraries so strongly here in Montgomery County. You may think that public libraries are just book warehouses. We are so very much more for all of the community. The thing that's most important about public libraries in the country today is that we are open to all, everyone. You don't have to say anything to us. You come in, use our resources, find a place to be, a place to engage with other community members. And the importance of public libraries in our country at this time is, I think, higher than ever. We are a resource for factual, truthful information about the world around us, about our country and our government. We help people navigate through all of the information that almost attacks us every single day. So I thank, again, the Council for their support of libraries. I hope everyone in this room has a library card and visits the library or takes advantage of our online resources, because the other aspect of public libraries is they're supported by you, taxpayers and residents of Montgomery County. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to read the proclamation. One of those online resources I tell everyone that will listen is you can access Rosetta Stone for free with your library card or at home here in Montgomery County if you want to learn a new language. And we often talk about 1/3 of our residents are foreign born, how many languages are spoken here. A lot of people don't know that we have that resource, one of many, many resources that hopefully you'll discover in Library Lovers Month. So a proclamation here: whereas libraries provide countless public services to all residents of our county, access to new languages, job assistance, and support for students. And whereas libraries serve as a vibrant community hub, allowing all residents to come together to grow, share, and learn. And whereas libraries perform a critical role in educating the public and enhancing the culture of our community. And whereas libraries provide us access to entirely new worlds, stories of our past, and the knowledge we need to build a better future. And whereas libraries are safe spaces for our children to grow, learn, and develop their imaginations, develop the creative thinking we need in the next generation. Now, therefore, be resolved that the County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland hereby recognizes the month of February 2020 as Library Lovers Month, presented on this day by myself and signed by the Council President, Sidney Katz, and the entire Council. Thank you so much, and give our libraries a big round of applause, please. The Council President and the previous Council President. Anita, hold on, one quick picture. We need a picture for you. Yes. If you guys, whatever. There's only one person. You can stand or not. You can come down, whatever you want to do. You know.
Oh, I don't know why. Thank you. And next, we have a proclamation recognizing Transit Equity Day by Councilmember Glass.
like to bring down members of the Transportation and Environment Committee, and also everybody else who's here to celebrate. Some of you who joined me earlier this morning on the ride from Silver Spring to Rockville on the Q2 bus, so we keep moving in tandem this morning. Today is Transit Equity Day, and a report by Harvard University back in 2015 showed that access to transit is the greatest indicator of an individual's ability to move up in society. And so we know that we have to focus on transportation as a key to economic mobility. And here in Montgomery County, we know that that is a critical piece of our policy planning because lower income communities are twice as likely to be without a car than other communities here in Montgomery County, which means they're more dependent on public transportation, which is why we have to ensure that everybody in our community has access to good, safe, reliable public transportation. And really proud of the efforts that the council undertook last year, or in this current FY20 budget, by expanding access to public transportation, particularly expanding the Kids Ride Free program, whereby in the first 6 months of that program, allowing kids to take the bus anytime that our bus systems operate, we had a 57% increase in youth ridership on Metrobus, on Ride-On Bus, and a 51% increase on ridership on Metrobus, which is huge, which shows that when we increase access to transit, people will take it, and that will help make our streets safer and more efficient for everybody in our region. I'd like to turn it over to the chair of the T&E committee for a few comments too.
Thank you, Councilmember Glass. I'm so pleased to chair the committee, especially with these two great allies of affordable housing and transit that I get to work with on the committee every day. Madam Past President, we spent a lot of last year talking about racial equity and social justice, and there's really nothing that brings more racial equity and social justice to Montgomery County than affordable housing and transit. They are two things that level the playing field and bring people together at a time when there's many, many forces increasing inequities, economic and racial and social inequities all across the country. We really count on our affordable housing and our transit to bring people together and level the playing field. That's why we're so glad to present this today, and I'm really grateful to all the advocates we have, because strong, effective advocacy, like raising a child, takes a village, and it's great to have labor unions and environmental groups and civil rights groups all working together for a common cause. That's how you get things done, at least here in Montgomery County. So thanks for your leadership on this.
Thank you, Evan Glass. I really appreciate your taking the initiative to bring this proclamation to us. Having access to transit is about having access to mobility, which opens the door to opportunity, creates dignity, creates independence, allows people to live their best life. And as you said, Councilmember Glass, there are many people who can't afford a car, and as a community, we want to have great public education, great public transportation, great public health, great public institutions. And when we do, then we create an inclusive and equitable community. So that's what this proclamation is all about, as our public transportation network, and it is truly one of our great tools to promote equity.
Just want to recognize some of our partners in this effort, not only here in Montgomery County, but throughout the entire DC region. Jane Lyons with the Coalition for Smarter Growth, Elizabeth Bunn with the Labor Sustainability Network, Julio Murillo with CASA, Kamita Gray with the Brandywine Community in Prince George's County, who took the bus with us. So she's been commuting since 6 o'clock this morning just to get here to Rockville today. So thank you for your dedication and commitment. And also Shruti Bachnager with the Montgomery County Sierra Club, who has a few comments.
Good morning, everyone. Oops. On behalf of all of us, we want to thank the Montgomery County Council for recognizing Transit Equity Day. Special thanks to Councilmember Evan Glass for riding the bus with us today, and to our T&E committee council members for supporting this initiative. Transportation is the largest source of climate disruptive pollution in Maryland, impacting most of our vulnerable communities that are also underserved by the existing public transportation system. We are committed to transit equity to ensuring affordable, frequent, reliable, and efficient service for all of our communities. This is a must for economic and environmental justice. Public transit gets people out of cars and helps those who cannot afford cars access to jobs, education, and other critical amenities. We will be celebrating Transit Equity Day today evening at CASA Multicultural Center, Langley Park, starting 6:30 p.m. So all of us would like to invite you to join us to that. There will be a panel of community and experts talking about this issue, and you are all welcome to participate. Thank you so much.
Now we'll read the proclamation. Whereas Montgomery County supports an affordable, reliable, and frequent transit system that connects people in all communities to their homes, schools, work, houses of worship, retail centers, medical facilities, and parks.
And whereas affordable transit is a social justice issue in which our lowest income communities have nearly double the number of carless households than our higher income communities, and
Whereas residents deserve neighborhoods that are connected by public transportation, bicycle pathways, and safe streets, and
Whereas county officials understand that access to transit is crucial to social mobility and that communities of color experience longer commutes than other residents, which further exacerbates the opportunity gap.
And whereas the Council unanimously passed the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act, removing barriers to opportunity and promoting equity in all policies, and
whereas communities of color, economically disadvantaged people, people with disabilities, and other marginalized populations deserve full access to safe, reliable, and accessible public transit, now therefore be it resolved that the County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland hereby recognizes February 4th, 2020 as Transit Equity Day and affirms Montgomery County's commitment to fair transit for all, presented on the 4th day of February, signed by Evan Glass and Sidney Katz, Council President.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements or petitions?
Good morning. We have one announcement this morning. The council is seeking applicants for the Board of Appeals. This position can only be filled by a Republican, a voter who is unaffiliated with a party, or a voter who is a member of another party officially recognized by the Board of Election. This position cannot be filled by a Democrat. The deadline for applications is Friday, 5th, 2020 at 5 p.m. We also have an addendum to the agenda today, adding to the consent calendar regarding the resolution for introduction, authorizing the creation of non-merit staff positions in individual council member offices. We're adding sponsors. The lead sponsor is Councilmember Hucker, and co-sponsors are Council Members Glass and Jawando. And adding for introduction on the consent calendar a supplemental appropriation to the county government's FY20 capital budget and CIP amendment for the Office of Agriculture, $3.4 million for agricultural land preservation easement. The public hearing is scheduled for February 25th at 1:30. Also adding for introduction a resolution condemning the recent Supreme Court decision on public charge immigration rule. Lead sponsor are Council Members Albornoz and Navarro, and co-sponsored by Council Members Katz, Jawando, Rice, Glass, Hucker, Reamer, and Friedson. Action is tentatively scheduled for February 25th, and there were no petitions this week.
Thank you very much. The minutes have been distributed for January 14th, 2020, and approval of a closed session minutes of that same day, January 14th, 2020. Unless there are any corrections, they will be approved as received. No corrections. Thank you. They are approved. Next, we have our consent calendar, and we need a motion to approve it. It's been moved by Councilmember Reamer and seconded by Councilmember Navarro that we approve our consent calendar. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to call to attention to my colleagues the addendum item number I, which is a resolution lead co-sponsored along with myself and Councilmember Nancy Navarro and all of our colleagues. This is directly in response to the decision that was made last week by the Supreme Court, passing along, once again, ideological lines, the further assault on immigrants in our country. This administration has taken nefarious and immoral steps, in my opinion, in directly attacking immigration, now both legal and illegal immigration. This particular measure is going to have a devastating effect in our community, and I'm sure that is exactly what the administration intends. Most of the immigrants that have arrived to our country did not arrive via first class, and that is certainly true of my family. Immigrants arrived to this country fleeing persecution, looking to advance their families, looking to gain economically, looking for the same reasons that so many generations have before them. This particular measure will gravely expand the federal government's definition of an immigrant's charge on our public system, and most nefariously permits the federal government to project what they think will be the impact of this particular individual to our country. This will disproportionately impact moderate and low-income immigrants across this country. If the immorality and the fact that this goes counterculture to the American values that we all profess our love for and admiration for doesn't get you, then please know that this will have both an economic and a health impact on local communities as well. We have confirmed through the Primary Care Coalition and our Department of Health and Human Services that immigrants have been less likely to access public health benefits that they are most absolutely entitled to. When members of our community don't access these public health benefits, it impacts all of us. I also want to stress the incredible economic impact that this could have on our communities as well. More than half of businesses in the state of Maryland since 2014 have been started by our immigrant community. The immigrant community contributes billions of dollars to our federal tax system and helps support programs and services that help both immigrants as well as U.S. citizens through Medicare and Medicaid and many other examples. This assault needs to stop. And the only body in our country right now that has the ability to stop it is Congress. We are fortunate that our federal delegation here in the state of Maryland and Montgomery County has stood with the immigrant community and our advocates in calling for comprehensive immigration reform. But until that federal immigration reform passes, this administration, left to their own devices, will continue to attack and scare and spread fear across our country. And that impacts all of us. And so I stand with my colleagues, united in opposition to this madness, and stand together demanding that our Congress take action as soon as possible to save families who are here now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, and well said. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, and I want to thank my colleague, Gabe Albornoz, who also chairs our HHS committee, for uplifting the voices of those who are not heard and are invisible. And I think this particular council has time and time and time again stepped up through resolutions, through particular actions to ensure that our county is a county that can be proud of its values. Here we are again, and as my colleague described, we hear a lot of rhetoric about undocumented immigrants and all of the fear that is attached to this term. Well, this is interesting because these are not undocumented immigrants that we're talking about. These are people who are going through the process of obtaining a green card, many citizenship, and time again what we are seeing is this erosion of the opportunity. And sometimes I hear people say, but why don't these people become, why don't they get their documents? Well, because it's not that simple. But when people follow the process, this is what they encounter. This is what happens. So number one, we need to make sure that people understand that. But number two, what my colleague Gabe Albornoz, Councilmember Albornoz described, is very important in real time. We are right now facing this worldwide concern of what seems to now be becoming a pandemic of the coronavirus, right? And many healthcare organizations throughout the country are saying that this particular decision has an impact because the data is clear that many people who could access healthcare have not been accessing healthcare that they need in order to ensure, right, that they're not out there propagating particular diseases, et cetera. And these healthcare organizations are talking about this charge in particular as having an impact that we should all be concerned about regarding something as real as this coronavirus. So this is no joke. This is not cute. This ongoing assault on people to be scapegoated as if the United States is not a country that has been built through this glorious value of inclusion and welcoming immigrants. I myself am an immigrant. This really, truly has become just completely unacceptable. And it's just exhausting. And perhaps that's what this administration wants, is for everybody to be exhausted by the onslaught. But make no mistake, we will feel the impact locally. Local governments are going to have to now make up for those particular benefits and the lack of access to those benefits. And this will have an impact on our public health as well. And so this is no joke. And I appreciate my colleagues and I appreciate Councilmember Albornoz for giving voice, because I know that there is just so much noise out there that these things get drowned out. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. And let's make sure that everybody understands the real impact that this will have on our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been moved and seconded that we approve our consent calendar. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And it is unanimous by those present. Thank you. Next is a call for bills of final reading. The first one is Bill 3519, Personnel Collective Bargaining, Certified Representative, Duty of Fair Representation. It went before the GO Committee, and it was recommended approval, and I will ask Councilmember Navarro to explain that to us, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'm going to share first a little bit of background regarding Bill 35-19. So the Supreme Court in Booth versus Detroit Board of Education in 1977 upheld a collective bargaining agreement between a union representing teachers and the public school board requiring bargaining unit members to either join the union or pay an equivalent service fee to the union to support its duty to represent all bargaining unit members. The court rejected a claim that this provision violated the First Amendment rights of employees who do not want to join the union, but required the union to reduce the service fee in an amount equal to the cost to express ideological or political views unrelated to collective bargaining. So 41 years later, different members of the Supreme Court overruled Abood and held that an agency shop clause in the public sector violated the First Amendment rights of public employees who choose not to join the union in Janus versus AFSCME, 2018. County collective bargaining laws require the exclusive representative to represent all bargaining units members and permit the union and the employer to negotiate an agency shop provision. The union, certified as the exclusive representative of each county employee bargaining unit, has negotiated an agency shop provision that is no longer valid under the Janus decision. Bill 35-19 would modify the union's duty of fair representation by permitting the union to refuse to process a grievance or arbitration on behalf of a bargaining unit member who chooses not to pay union dues unless the employee pays the union the reasonable cost to process the grievance or arbitration. Bill 35-19 is patterned after a recent state law making similar modifications to the duty of fair representation for the exclusive representative of MNCPPC employees. So this bill would amend the duty of fair representation for a certified representative of county employees, authorize their certified representative to impose the reasonable cost of filing a grievance or pursuing arbitration on an employee who does not pay membership dues or equivalent, and permit a certified representative to refuse to file a grievance or pursue arbitration for an employee who does not pay membership dues or the equivalent unless an employee pays the reasonable cost imposed. This bill was introduced by Councilmember Hucker and Councilmember Friedson and Council President Katz, who are members of the GO committee, and myself reviewed the bill, we discussed the bill, and we decided to support it. And we voted 3-0 to enact it. It's introduced without amendments, and Mr. Drummer was the one who prepared the packet and walked us through this process as well. So I do want to express my appreciation. And so that is what you have in front of you this morning.
Thank you very much. Mr. Drummer, did you have anything to add?
No, I think Ms. Navarro said everything that I would have said.
Very good. Well, this is
Probably said it better.
Well, you wrote a lot of good stuff here, in all fairness, Bob. This is a roll call vote. Madam Clerk, please.
Mr. Glass?
Yes.
Mr. Glass votes yes. Mr. Jawando?
Yes.
Mr. Jawando votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes.
Mr. Reamer votes yes. Ms. Navarro?
Yes.
Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Albornoz?
Yes.
Mr. Albornoz votes yes. Mr. Friedson?
Yes.
Mr. Friedson votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes.
So it's 8-0. Thank you. It passes. And next, we're going to, absolutely, thank you. I was wondering where that was. Next is the spending affordability guidelines for FY21 capital budget and other general CIP assumptions. And that also went before the GO committee. And Councilmember Navarro, did you want to explain that to us, please?
Sure. So the GO committee met to go through the recommended spending affordability guidelines, and Dr. Orland prepared, as always, a really awesome packet that walked us through every single decision. I will note that I believe Councilmember Friedson was not there that day, so it was 2-0 in terms of the decisions that we made. But he is supportive, and he had indicated that.
Yep.
And so I think what I'll do, though, instead of just going to the notes, Dr. Orland, I'm going to turn it to you, and you can just go through everything. We can just say that we basically concurred with the executive's recommendation with a one particular exception in terms of the impact taxes, which is decided to go with a slightly higher revenue assumption, but everything else we agreed. So I'll just turn it over to you, and Ms.
Thank you.
Beck is here, and
We'll try and make it
Mr.
quick.
Smith is here.
Thank you. First of all, Gene Smith and I co-authored the packet, so I want to acknowledge Gene's
Thank you, Mr.
participation
Smith.
in
Yes,
this.
thank you, Gene.
And Mary Beck joins us as the capital budget guru for OMB. Long time. As Ms. Navarro mentioned, the committee concurred or confirmed the guidelines for spending for general obligation bonds that you set last October 1st. The executive agrees with it as well. It's a total of $1.77 billion over the 6-year period, and it continues to slightly ramp down in the later years the bond limits to try to finally, over time, get the debt under control. And there's a lot of background here about what's changed since September. Some the indicators have gone up, some have gone down, but there's no reason under the law to actually change the guidelines either up or down. The law says you can change the guidelines, but only if there's a change in economic conditions. There really hasn't been a significant move one way or the other. In terms of inflation, we typically get this information from the Department of Finance, and they're forecasting actually much lower inflation over the next 6 years, as was assumed actually last September. It's a full percentage point less than what it has been. Those those inflation numbers are likely to change again in March. They usually change a little bit when the executive sends over his operating budget recommendations in March. So we'll keep you up to date on that. On page 4, item number 3, the set-aside, this for bond-funded projects, this is the essentially the general obligation bond reserve, the part of what could be programmed which is not programmed. It's being kept for things that come up that you haven't anticipated, or, for example, projects that are in facility planning now, which over the next year or two will emerge as candidate projects. You need the fiscal space to be able to fund them. And so typically you'll find a small reserve in the first year, and it slowly builds over the 6-year period. The exec's recommendations are in bold in table number 3, and it follows the general pattern that has been the case in the past CIPs. So the committee concurs with that as well. PAYGO, the bottom page 4, the policy has been for about a decade that we program at least 10% of what we could fund in bond-eligible projects with cash. That's what PAYGO is. And as in past years, it is exactly 10%. So this is 10% of the guidelines, those numbers on the bottom of table 4 on page 4. Committee concurs with that. Page 5, first the recordation tax. You recall in December when you went over the fiscal plan update that Finance was recommending or seeing that there's likely to be a somewhat faster growth in both the recordation tax premium and the recordation tax increment for schools, and that's reflected in here in the executive CIP, and the committee concurs with that. The one difference, Ms. Navarro highlighted it, has to do with the impact tax revenues, both from schools and from transportation. The Finance Department looked over the past 11 years, I should say, in terms of what the rolling average was of how much revenue we get. Impact taxes are probably the hardest revenue source to be able to forecast because it builds directly into the building cycle. You don't know if it's going to go up or down. Transportation impact tax is even harder because what takes into account there are credits. We don't know when there are sizable amounts of credits out there that developers have because they would have built a road or something which they can get under the law dollar for dollar credit for. We don't know when those credits are going to hit. So they had looked at the last 11 years and came up with a base number as to how much we thought we would be collecting as a county, but then also decremented that by the amount that foregone revenue for the bills that allow for market rate houses to be essentially exempt from impact taxes if the development provides 25% or more of affordable housing. They anticipate from the 11 projects that are actually out there right now that have either gone through the process or in the pipeline or working its way through, that will produce, I guess in a negative way, $92 million less in revenue than we would otherwise have. They think that's going to hit over a 10-year period, so they reduce this sort of rolling average amount by $9.2 million a year, and that's how they came up with their recommendation, which is considerably below what had been assumed in the last CIP. So, for example, for the transportation impact tax, the table 8 on page 7, you'll see that the resulting revenue estimate is about $3.3 million, $3.2 million less per year, and for schools, it's about almost $5 million less per year. The only difference that staff had with what the executive branch and finance had done was we think they should have looked at a 10-year average rather than 11-year. That the 11th year was 2009, which was a particularly bad year, it was sort of an outlier. The last 10 years, other than being sort of a round number, is more indicative of what's been happening. That, when you go through the math, produces a slightly higher revenue amount for both schools and for transportation, but it's still a considerable drop from what was assumed in the approved CIP. So you'll see the under table 8, the FY 21-26 C staff, that was the council staff's recommendation for transportation. School impact tax at table 9, the same thing, and the committee concurred with that. State school construction aid, we ended up getting $58.7 million in FY 20 from the state, and the executive is recommending just using that same amount as an assumption every year from this point on, and committee concurs with that. Current revenue in the CIP, this is top of page 9. This is cash in the CIP which are for projects that are not bond eligible, so planning, facility planning, computers, that sort of thing. And the executive is recommending a number which is actually considerably higher than what was in the amended CIP, but on a year-to-year basis, when you look at FY 21 versus FY 22, FY 23, it's not that different. And as a starting point, the committee concurs that this is what we ought to use, at least for the time being. But as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and every year the executive comes over on March 15th with his operating budget, and to make everything work, almost, in fact, always recommends some kind of reduction in what his earlier recommendation was. So expect that FY21 number actually come down a bit. We just don't know how much. They're in the process of developing the operating budget now. And the committee concurred with that. And finally, on park and planning bonds, you recall last summer, the planning board recommended raising the rates, raising the levels from 6.6, 6.7 a year up to $8 million. Their idea being that that extra amount of money, if it were used for level of effort projects for infrastructure maintenance like PLAR, roof replacement, et cetera, that those result in operating savings which ought to, theoretically at least, counterbalance any increase in debt service, and that would be a good thing. The executive would recommend staying at the same levels. The council sort of came in between, which is to say, well, let's give this $8 million level a trial in FY21 and 22 and see if, in fact, what the planning board's recommending comes to pass. If it does, then when you do this process 2 years from now, for the FY23 to 28 CIP, you might go to $8 million for each of those years, but right now it would be premature. Those are the committee's recommendations. I'll just say just one word about the rest of the packet. Typically, when we go to the full council before the start of a new CIP, and we don't do this every 2 years, but sometimes it's every 4 years or so, we do have just a summary of what the total executive's recommendations are and comparing that to the agency's request. This is really just background information for you. And then towards the end of it on page 12 and 13, are sort of guidance from us, frankly, as to how to think about the CIP as you're going through it. We can talk about it if you want, but we don't have a formal presentation on that. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith or Ms. Beck, did you have anything to add? No?
I think just we've been meeting with council members when they had an interest in doing so, particularly for new council members, and they've been very good, productive conversations.
Thank you. This is an action item, and it went before the GO committee, so this is a hand vote. All those in favor of passing this, please raise your hand. All those, thank you. All those opposed, that carries unanimously by those present. And Dr. Wallin, this is actually your last packet. Is that what you're?
It wasn't my last packet. And then my last packet on spending.
Didn't you announce that at our meeting, Glenn?
Yeah. Well, I'm from this point on, the lead on spending affordability will be Mr. Smith, and the lead on CIP reconciliation will be Mr. Levchenko. But I'm an eminence grizzled. I'll be around.
Well, and we're very glad for that. But you do deserve a round of applause for everything that you've done.
I'm not going away.
Believe me, Gene told me that earlier today. He said, no, we'll have him.
Well, after that
around.
round of applause, I think you have to. That's the rule.
Jay, you won't have Glenn Orland to kick around anymore. All right, thank you. Next is the district council session, and that's an action item for zoning text amendment 1909, prohibited roof signs exceptions. That went before the Fed committee, and we're going to ask Councilmember Reamer to please explain that to us.
I'm going to ask Councilmember Friedson, who introduced this one. It went through without a whole lot of controversy, so perhaps he'd like to take the moment to explain his zoning text amendment.
Yeah, thank you to the chair, thank you to the committee, thank you to colleagues for supporting this. It's a small but important gesture related specifically to signs on buildings. It reflects the fact that the code did not reflect the reality. It was restricted to a very small number of areas in the county. We have challenges that we need to look at certain aspects of the code that no longer reflect the modern, more urban community that we now have. This is one small piece of it. There are more actions, I think, that are required to come moving forward, but I didn't think that we should wait to make all kinds of changes in order to make one that seemed obvious and supported by everybody. But as caretakers of local government, we need to ensure that rules and regulations keep up with the times. This one was an example that didn't. The county is urbanizing, and development is occurring differently than it had in the past, particularly with mixed use rather than suburban-style strip malls that traditionally had only one forward-facing structure that faced a parking lot, which then abutted or abuts a street. It's now uncommon to see new strip malls being built. We're much more often seeing new lifestyle centers, new mixed-use developments with more dense development closer to transit. And since it's Transit Equity Day, I think that's a positive development in order to access the amenities in our community for a broader swath of our residents. Modern architectural design is also evolving. We're seeing a greater variety of building materials employed. It's changing the nature of signage requested by commercial and retail tenants, and this is just a small way to reflect that as well. So we talk about removing obstacles to doing business in our county. We need to look at broad brush factors that make it harder to do business here, but we also need to look at the nitty-gritty details that make it more difficult to do business, make it more difficult to operate, make it more difficult to be able to compete in a regional and a increasingly global economy. So there's certainly market forces that we can't control. There's certainly aspects of the economy and the process that we can't control, but there's plenty that we can control, and this is just a small gesture to be able to control it here. So I appreciate the support of the committee and look forward to the support of all of my colleagues.
Okay, is that good? Thank you very much. This one is a roll call vote. So, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Glass?
Yes.
Mr. Glass votes yes. Mr. Jawando?
Yes.
Mr. Jawando votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes.
Mr. Reamer votes yes. Ms. Navarro?
Yes.
Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Albornoz?
Yes.
Mr. Albornoz votes yes. Mr. Friedson?
Yes.
Mr. Friedson votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr.
So
Katz
that makes
votes
it-
yes.
Thank you. It makes it unanimous by those present. And next, we're going to go to an overview for the Germantown plan for the town sector zone. Oh, and Ms. Dunn will be explaining that to us.
Good morning. I'm here today with planning staff. Sorry, don't have much of a voice. I do less talking. The Germantown plan, you're going to have a public hearing this afternoon on it. It's a limited plan area, it's a sector plan, and it's about translating the town sector zone. The council did this for Montgomery Village. It was another area that was planned and built out through the town sector zone. After the zoning rewrite, that zone was no longer recommended to be retained, and it actually had with it a lifespan, a 50-year lifespan. And so that time limit has now been reached in the Germantown area where that zone exists. So this planning effort was to go through there and rezone the areas that were town sector into zoning that represents what's built today. So I'm going to let the planning staff take over, but that's really what the Germantown plan is all about.
Very good. Hopefully your voice will feel better. One of the few times I've ever gotten a standing ovation was in high school when I had laryngitis. But anyhow, who's the next speaker?
Well, thank you.
Please?
I just want to introduce the discussion. For the record, Gwen Wright, Planning Director. This, is a small plan, but a very important one to make sure that all of our zoning is keeping pace with our new zoning code, and that we are making sure that all of the properties in the county are zoned appropriately. I'd like to introduce two staff people who have not presented a lot before the council in the past, but who you probably will be seeing more frequently with projects in our Area 3, which is our more up-county and agricultural area. Jamie Pratt and Philip Estes, who were the key staff working on this project. And I'll turn it over to Jamie and Philip.
Good morning, council members. My name is Philip Estes with Montgomery Planning. I'm here with the project team, and today we are presenting the planning board draft of the Germantown plan for the town sector zone. So first off, just to orient you, the master plan area consists of the Churchill Village community in Germantown, which is located in the up-county area of Montgomery, as you can see here on the map, with indicated by the star. Churchill Village is located west of I-270 and north of Father Hurley Boulevard, east of Little Seneca Lake, and south of Black Hills Park. So this master plan, if approved, would amend the 1989 Germantown plan just for this, just for the Churchill Village area. Here you can see the master plan area is outlined in lavender on the map, and the yellow outline on the aerial photo. Churchill Village is a community of about 14,000 residents and is, of course, part of Germantown. The plan area is approximately 1,400 acres with about 5,700 existing units, housing units. The town sector zone was originally established 50 years ago, the second of two Montgomery County places to apply a planned development zone that at the time was an innovative means for creating new towns envisioned by the county's 1964 general plan. The other area that had a town sector zone was Montgomery Village, and some of you may recall was similarly rezoned in 2016. Here the town sector zone was established in Churchill Village, one of 6 villages that would, with a designated town center, constitute Germantown. 50 years later, Germantown's villages and the town center are well established and developed. And the plan area has grown from mostly an agricultural area in the late 1960s to a community of several neighborhoods defined by its lakes, expansive tree canopy, abundant open space, trail system, and diverse housing types. It's important to note, actually, that this entire area, the Churchill area, generally developed in accordance with the development plan that was approved in 1968. However, the evolution of land use policy in the county has diminished the applicability of the town sector zone, and as a result of the 2014 zoning ordinance rewrite, the town sector zone was phased out and is no longer used when master plans are developed. And additionally, as part of the development plan, the Churchill Village Development Plan that was approved in 1968, it had a 50-year horizon that prohibited rezoning applications, and so that zoning control has now expired. And this is really the primary reason that we are engaging this effort. So therefore, in that context, this master plan is generally a technical rezoning area effort, given the fact that communities nearly built out and there are no major land use changes recommended. And this will give you a short tour of what the community looks like and has been developed. Today, Churchill Village provides a wide variety of housing types, including single-family houses, townhomes, duplexes, apartments, and condos. Most of the housing was constructed between 1960 and 1994. There are 3 public schools, Lake Seneca Elementary, Waters Landing Elementary, and Martin Luther King Middle School. There are also 2 private schools, professional offices, some neighborhood serving commercial, and including some small-scale restaurants in the area. Churchill Village also provides ample parkland and open space, lakeside parks and walkways, internal trails, recreation areas, playgrounds, and the 2 lakes mentioned, Lake Churchill and Little Seneca Lake. In fact, one of the county's most extensive and integrated trail system is located in Churchill Village. Both HOA-owned and public trails are really well integrated across the community. So therefore, Churchill Village, its close proximity to the town center and all of those amenities continue to make Churchill Village a sought-after place to live and raise families. The master plan's purpose, as mentioned, is to replace the outdated town sector zoning with current zoning categories And as a result of our community engagement process and outreach, 3 plan goals were identified. The first goal is to maintain the residential core, which you can see here in the map is shaded in yellow, gold, and brown. These areas account for the greatest share of the land use, about 45% of the plan area. Goal 2 is to protect existing open space and recreation areas, which you can see here in blue and green. With Lake Churchill and Little Seneca Lake and other open space, this accounts for about 30% of the plan area. And our third goal is to support the neighborhood commercial uses, which are located in the lower southeast corner in red and pink. Commercial uses are really a small part of the Churchill Village community at only about 1% of the land area. So combined, these goals describe the vision and the desired results of the master plan effort. Next, I will turn it over to Jamie, and he will review the zoning recommendations.
All right, I'm Jamie Pratt, as Phil mentioned, and I just wanted to go through our methodology for how we came up with the zones we're recommending. It was, we looked at the residential zones and then the commercial zones and then the other land uses to figure out what best fit what was on the ground. So for example, with the housing, we looked at, was it a single family home? Was it a townhouse? Was it an apartment building? And then how many units per acre currently exist in the ground, and combine that with some of the typical lot sizes for those residential uses. We came up with a recommended zone. Now, I do want to mention that you see there's an interactive zoning map, so if you do feel the need to drill down into individual blocks, this tool allows you to go block by block and see what's on the ground currently and what our recommendations are. So this map shows the form of the houses. You know, the yellows are the single family down to the green townhouses, and the brown multifamily housing. There is one small area of duplexes within this plan, and the numbers shown on the map are the densities. So the residential densities in the single family neighborhoods might be, you know, 3.5, 4.5 units. Some of the multifamily housing gets up.
Excuse me one moment. Hans, Councilmember Reamer has a question.
Thank you. This really bears on the conversation we had yesterday. This is really interesting. I just wanted to call my colleagues' attention. There's so much conversation about single-family zoning, you know, nationally. This is like a national planning conversation. It's worth noting that communities like this, an example of which, you know, we have many examples of this in Montgomery County, were intentionally planned with a variety of housing types. So you have multifamily, townhouse, duplex, and single family, all within, this was probably a farm, I would guess, you know, was master planned at once. So, you know, Montgomery County, you have to look, you have to peel the onion a little bit further on where housing types were not allowed from the beginning. You know, this is just a good example, I think, of good planning that mixes different types. And so I think you walk away from this saying, we've got different, you know, we have achieved the goal of allowing different types of structures in this place. Thanks.
Yeah, I've always thought this is a good example.
One other second, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think that, I mean, it's clear that for a very long time, people understood, and I would say especially immigrants understood, that if you went up county to, you know, Gaithersburg or Germantown is where you could find your step-up housing, because there was definitely more townhouses and apartments that were larger, duplexes that were available. And I assume it's because also there were more opportunities to build these as the down county area, et cetera, was totally built out. And so there was a lot more opportunities, and that occurred. So I feel like it was also just the opportunity in the market, which now we're definitely beginning to see the challenges that we don't have as much, you know, land available as back in the day when these decisions were made. And now we're trying to, now we're in this challenge, you know, area of having to figure out where do we see opportunities in the down county area, in the mid county, et cetera, to diversify this. But there's no doubt that when you go to the Up County, you see this mix, which was so important for those who were trying to find that affordability and be able to continue to make Montgomery County home. So I find it very interesting. Yeah.
It worked.
Please continue.
I also want to point out there is one really dark brown thing here. This is Churchill Senior Living, and it's not fully built out, but it's mostly built out. And if it was fully built out, it would have 54 units per acre. So it's a bit of an outlier for the rest of the neighborhoods in this plan, but it's also the newest project in the entire plan area. For the commercial zoning, we did a similar exercise where we looked at how many square feet are currently on the ground, calculated an FAR, and looked at the uses to determine which zone supported those uses, and just assigned it correspondingly. So this shows you the commercial and some of the institutional uses. There's 2 private daycares in the area, vet office, this neighborhood serving retail mix, and there's a storage, self-storage there, and a towing facility, and then there's office condominiums. And then for the other uses with schools, churches, local parks, lakes, etc., we have kind of a standard we use in the planning department to assign a zone to those properties, which we don't expect to develop anyway. And so that this map shows you the vast extent of the part within the town, within the plan area that is currently part of the lake or part of the Black Hill Regional Park. And there's a few HOA open spaces, a couple of schools, 1 church, and 1 neighborhood park. And to do our analysis within the plan book, we broke the plan area up into 4 different districts: northwest, southwest, etc. And so we show in greater detail each of those zones here. The number corresponds to a table in the plan that shows you the recommendations for that particular zoning block. So I don't know if we need to concentrate on any of these in particular. And finally, we have the 1 vacant parcel in our entire plan area. It is as well as the Churchill Senior Living Facility. And we wanted to recommend a zone that would make the most sense here, and we wanted to kind of zone these 2 properties consistently with each other. So after analyzing the density on the Churchill Senior Living site, we decided that a residential FAR of 1.25 would allow the density they have, along with a little bonus density. And for the, there's currently no commercial services in that building, but we did think that this might be an ideal location for a few neighborhoods serving retail uses in the undeveloped corner. So we do allow a small component, 0.25 FAR, for commercial uses that might want to locate on the corner. But we also have a recommendation in the plan that commercial only be a part of a project that also provides residences. So we don't want there just to be a shopping center there. We want it to be a mixed use. And this was a rendering that a colleague of ours, Roberta Duke, made to show what this might look like with a small, maybe a cafe, a dry cleaner, some other little small shop in the corner of an otherwise multifamily building with the parking tucked underneath. But this is just an illustrative example. And so with that, we are done with our show and tell of the plan area.
Okay.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. Any other presentations other than, no? There are no questions? Yeah, there's no questions that are from our council, and we did want to note that the public hearing is this afternoon, and it starts at 1:30. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to thank you all for your work. This was very thorough, and we enjoyed it in committee, and I think it's look forward to working with you more as we head up county. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a feeling we'll see you this afternoon. Thank you. Next, we're going to have a work session on community grants. As we begin, if I could ask everyone to please leave the room, and if you have a conversation, please have it out in the hallway. The goal for, if, Hans, could you take the conversation out in the hallway, please? We're going to continue our meeting. The goal for today's discussion on community grants is to receive an update on FY21 community grants process and timeline. We're going to work through questions about the overall process from FY21 and beyond. It's my intent and hope to leave this room with a defined county council vision for the community grants program, including its overall purpose. In July 2019, Government Operations and Health and Human Services held a joint meeting to discuss a vision and a strategy for the community grants process. We heard from council staff about Grants 1.0, Grants 2.0, and Grants 3.0. The committee directed council staff to proceed with its collaborative efforts with the executive branch to develop a plan for moving towards a new organizational structure for partnering with nonprofit organizations. That work is summarized in today's packet, and we thank you for the packet. There are three key assumptions that need to be addressed here. First is the establishment of the Office of Grants Management. Yes, 6 council members sponsor or co-sponsor this bill, but we are still in the middle of the legislative process. This bill is subject to a committee work session and final council vote. Second, from my reading on the response to question 5 as we go through the packet on page 8, the purpose of the community grants program has been assumed but not agreed to by this body. To what end are these grants being awarded? And the OLO report, the Office of Legislative Oversight report, reminded us that the executive and council grants originated to provide funding to community nonprofit organizations to provide health and human services and community programs to county residents. The intent was that the grant funding would be on a one-time basis and would fill the gaps in services. On page 8 of the packet, as we go through, it states, the initial purpose of the community grants program is to allow for a mechanism for community partners to enter into a one-year grant contracts to pilot new and innovative programs that serve and reach county residents in a culturally competent manner. As council, and we're going to work on discuss this, but is the council staff saying that this was the original purpose for many years ago, or is this the stated purpose moving forward? If it's the latter, when was that decision made? And at the end of the day, we're providing to community grants to fill gaps in services, pilot innovative programs, both something else. This is the question we need to answer. Third, the FY21 community grant application includes a mapping of nonprofit programming areas to the county executive's 7 priorities. Is there an assumption that future community grants will be tied to the executive's priority areas? And one final point that I'd like to make before we turn it over for the discussion is that I firmly believe that an allocation of funding for FY21 community grants must, and I'm underlining the word must, include money for promising new organizations and programs, in addition to renewals for viable and effective grantees from past years. We have been working on the grants program possibilities and discussions for many years. We all realized that something needed to be done, and I think this is a way that we can get forward. But I do believe that we need to make certain that we're all clear on what we'll be getting forward and with our partners in the nonprofit community. And with that, I guess we're going to hand it over to someone. Carolyn, are you? Yeah, please.
Hello,
Yep.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Chen, Legislative Analyst with the County Council. Thank you so much for the introduction and summarizing actually the interests and priorities of the council today. This full council session was requested by Councilmember Friedson and Rice in order to get to keep going on our progress updates on what's going on with community grants. A couple of points on what we're discussing here today. You are correct about the Office of Grants Management. We have a work session on March 5th that will be completely separate from this. But in conjunction, just to be clear, that the reform of the community grants is part of the legislation that's going forward with the Office of Grants Management, because without the long-term vision, you're really just talking about 1 year after 1 year. So while they are two separate discussions, and we won't talk about the office today, do want to point out that it is a long-term vision, 2.0 to 3.0. Second, on contracting, this was actually from a great conversation I had with Friedson yesterday about what are we trying to do? We're trying to shift the mindset and the philosophy that we are granting funds, partial funds for programs that are essential for residents, and entering into vendor contracts that extend and expand the services that departments need to fulfill underneath their priorities. Where we are right now is partial funding of lots of organizations. We need to realign in this upcoming 2 years in order to figure out capacity and to have a plan going forward. I will address the 7 priorities as I see it, and then do you want to? Yeah, sure. Okay, great. So what the third point that Councilmember Cass was talking about is page 11. Number 15, and this was the mapping of the 7 priorities of the county executive to the program areas of the community grants. So in the past, in our application, we've had applications reviewed by program area or organizational size or budget, and the map, the arrows, the categories to the arrows to the right is what we've been historically been looking at. Healthcare for medical uninsured, mental and behavioral health, seniors, socialization, all of that's been separate. In order to match with what the budget process of what the county executive is doing, we did map those program areas to the 7 priority areas, so that would be very clear to organizations what we said when we're saying county executive priorities. This was not necessarily how they will be reviewed, that just we wanted people to understand where their program fell within their priority areas. And then I'll have OMB respond.
Go ahead, please.
Joshua Waters with the Office of Management and Budget. I did want to introduce my colleague, Rafael Pumarejo Murphy. He's due to the Office of Management and Budget and will be taking on more responsibilities with the community grants portfolio. So thank you all for having this discussion today. I do want to follow up by saying that following the October work session between the GO and HHS committees, we did do a lot of extensive outreach, which Ms. Chen outlines really well in the packet, to nonprofit organizations. I would like to give a shout out to Nonprofit Montgomery, who did a great job helping us arrange a forum and holding focus groups with a number of nonprofit communities to get the feedback from them on how this would impact, any changes would impact the community grants process and how it would impact their processes. As for the specific question regarding how programs are mapped to the 7 priority outcomes, as Ms. Chen said, we did this as a way to gather data. So as we're looking at the executive's FY21 operating budget, we're trying to figure out how those align with those 7 priority outcome areas. It doesn't necessarily mean that in the future the funding would be allocated by the 7 priority outcome areas. You could allocate it on a high level like that. You could also allocate it by saying $300,000 or whatever amount of funding that the council and executive would like to fund to food service programs. So you could do it in 2 different ways: a high level allocation or a topic specific allocation. But the reason we were doing this, we asked organizations to map to the 7 priority outcome areas, was to give us an idea as we're building with council the FY21 budget, how community grants currently map. So it gives us an idea for shaping and making recommendations for FY22 and beyond.
Any questions on the priority areas mapping, and I can move on to the allocation of new programs and funds for fiscal year 21? Okay.
Councilmember Fritzen.
I have a lot of questions, as you can imagine. On this specific one, the question is whether this used to be a joint effort. We're moving it over to the executive branch. Is going to be a question of how we're moving it over to the executive branch with the March 5th discussion on what the community grants office looks like, or frankly, even if there is a community grants office, there's a current question between the Office of Management and Budget and the legislation itself of whether it would be done through OMB with existing resources or whether we'd have a separate office, which I thought was the whole purpose of the bill personally. But the broader question to me is specific to the 7 policy areas, but I think broader to the question of what role does the council have in this. I think that we all share the interest in streamlining this process of making sure that it's accountable, that it's matched with effectiveness and results for the taxpayer money we're investing in nonprofits, that it's clear with those nonprofits. I'm not sure that it's totally clear right now for me or for colleagues, and certainly not for a lot of the nonprofit partners of what this process is going to look like. It feels like a moving target to me. It's been quite a moving target since October. But are we agreeing to those 7 policy areas? I mean, those are not our policy areas. I totally respect the fact that the county executive has 7 policy areas that he is setting up the government, his executive branch, based off of. But if we're part of this process, I think we ought to have a role in the policy areas that the community grants program is focused on. And it's not clear to me that we will have a role. And based on the previous committee work session, I think it was pretty clear. I raised this issue then, and several others spoke to this issue as well. But the question is when and if we would have a role as the council, as the organization or entity of county government that actually has budget authority to determine how and by whom the money is spent to serve what purpose.
So actually, the county council will have more control over the decisions of the community grants process. In the past, the program areas were not tracked. You were not able to make priorities or funding decisions based on particular priorities. Last year was the first year that the GEO committee actually put down priorities of climate change, senior isolation, discontented youth. That was the first time in the history of grants. So what we're doing now is putting this upfront and from the beginning, that these are the program areas that we have traditionally funded in the past. They are now mapped to priority areas of this county executive, actually only so that we're more transparent in the beginning to say, look, here's what they might be looking at. We don't know. But if you see, there's only 2 priority areas that community grants even falls under, which is thriving youth and families and a welcoming community. So it's in terms of all 7 being a priority is not really relevant, particularly in the community grant process. What I'm hoping we can discuss that this year really is important to collect the data. We don't have data or evidence to base on what program areas are a priority in this gap filling process of community grants. And the process we've outlined with the review of into a base budget allows for department and contract monitor input in order to realign grant contracts into the department they should be monitored in. And I think that's step 1. Step 2 is figuring out what the gaps are. That can't be done without collecting the data first, and we've never done that analysis. We hope to this year.
So I got to say, I'm still confused as to how setting up the 7 priority areas of the county executive, saying they don't matter, saying that they only really fit into 2
At the time, there was
buckets.
going
I
to
just
be
don't really
results
understand
teams that were reviewed based on priority area. That was the first discussion, and that's the reason why we put them into 7, because results teams of each of the priority, the bulk teams, were going to review. That is no longer the case.
So just to pause for a second, the 2 questions really are, in the reform of the community grants process, FY22 and beyond, and it was discussed at the county, the joint committee session back in October, that most of the major reforms that we're talking about to the community grants process, moving it toward an outcome-based approach, as opposed to one-off grants, where the council and executive would set the priorities in terms of whether it be on broad ideas like the priority outcomes, or whether it be on specific topics like positive youth development, food security, economic development, those types of things. That's for FY22. In terms of, and included in that is the establishment of an Office of Grants Management, whether that be within a department or whether that be a separate entity, or whether it exists. That's up to the council. That's up to the council to decide. And so that gets us back to what do you do in the transition year for FY21? And there's been discussion, and we discussed this with council back in October about some ideas floating out there for the transition year. One of the ideas that was put forth would be to just do a straight renewal of FY20 applications, just to maintain a continuation of services, so that there's not a break in service as we transition and develop a new plan for FY22 and beyond. The committee made it very clear that they didn't just want us to look at the FY20 applications, that the committees wanted a 3-year look back. They wanted us to look at what was awarded in FY18, FY19, and FY20 in order to come to a recommendation as to what should be funded for FY21 and renewals. In addition to that, the committees also made it very clear that new funding should be available for new or innovative programs or to fill specific funding gaps. So what we did, we conducted the focus groups after October with the nonprofit organizations, and we presented them with several different options, like what would work best for your operations. And overwhelmingly, the organization said they liked the idea of doing the renewal with a 3-year look-back application. They also liked the idea of having a pot of money available for new programs. So in developing the application for FY21, council staff and OMB worked together to put together an application where we have streamlined the application. We've simplified the application. We also got feedback from the nonprofit community as to how the application would look, took that feedback and incorporated it into the application itself. So there's one application that people can apply for renewals, where they put in the amounts received and the purposes and how they spent the money and the impacts they're making on the lives of Montgomery County residents for FY18, 19, and 20. So that'll be looked at separately than the new or enhanced programming, new programming, which will be looked at. From a timing perspective, as we're putting together the budget, we really wanted to hear back from the nonprofit community before we opened up the application portal. Traditionally, the application portal opens up early December. Because we were conducting the focus group still, the application deadline got pushed back a couple of weeks. The application open date got pushed back a couple of weeks. So from a timing perspective, we were unable to, as we're putting together the recommended budget, to put together a list of the renewal applications and the renewal recommendations, as well as the new program recommendations. So in talking to the executive and talking to council staff, what the executive sent over in a memo to recommend would be to, okay, so we can take a look at the renewal applications as part of the recommended budget and make recommendations to council on what the renewal applications will look like. And those recommendations are expected to come across on March 16th with the executive's recommended budget. The council will have a chance to take a look at those, to consider them. Council can add to them, or, as has happened in the past, delete a few if council sees fit. And then the executive's intent is to include a line item for a pot of money for new programs. And so what Ms. Chen and OMB are working on right now is developing a review process on how we are going to review the new applications. But for the renewal applications, what we are doing is we're doing an administrative review in OMB. We want to make sure that the organization providing the service is doing so according to their contract, that they're achieving their outcomes. We're seeking input from the departments that are currently administering the community grants to get their input as to, are these organizations providing services? Are they in good standing with the state? Are they accomplishing the goals that they're intending to accomplish with the county's money? And so that information will be put together. We'll take it to the executive, who will make his recommendation as to what include in his recommended budget. I'm happy to provide that information to Ms. Chen after March 16th, so she can have the same information in terms of feedback from the departments who are administering the grants.
Could you share, I think first of all, I think the framework of setting up the new pot of money, I think that was Councilmember Albernaz's request and suggestion, and I think that is a positive one, so that we are continuing to innovate, and I mean, that's part of the purpose of this program. But it would be helpful, because that is different than what we had talked about in the committee work session. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is not the same, which is part of why this feels a bit like a moving target. Doing an analysis and a review of the efficacy of the programs and whether they're fulfilling the goals based on, effectively based on outcomes. I'm not saying that's a bad idea. I think it's actually a good idea, but it's not. That was not clear to the organizations or to us when we started. So if you could share with us before March 16th of who's deciding that, what is it being based off of? I think it should be shared not just with us, but it should be shared publicly on the website. I mean, I have had concerns through the process of the timeliness of communications. I mean, I know you mentioned the delay of when the applications would go up. I think it was only 17 business days that the applications were available before the deadline. So as soon as we can, to let folks know what they're being judged based off of, because it was always my impression that we were going to wait until after the transition year to make it very clear with folks of what they were being graded on. Whereas now it feels like we're slightly changing that, and that is not how we left. We didn't take any votes at the October work session, but certainly council members shared their views, but that is different from where we had left it when we were going to basically hold the organizations harmless and do the 3-year look back. That was where the conversation was left.
So every year when the executive, when we at OMB do our administrative review of community grants, we take the list of community grant applicants, we send it to the departments to take a look at. As they are looking at the grant applicants, we've asked them to give us feedback as to, are the current applicants, are the current grantees fulfilling their roles? And that information is shared with the executive when the executive makes his recommendation to the council on what gets funded. If a grantee is not fulfilling the contractual obligation that they have under the grant, that information is shared with the executive as he's trying to make as he's making his recommendation.
I'd appreciate if you could share past year examples of that, of organizations that were found to not be fulfilling their contractual obligations that had applied the following year and were not funded. I'd appreciate that as well, because that is not the process that I have ever heard or been aware of. But of course, I'm new here, so it's possible that it happened. I just didn't know it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to touch base on what we've been working on. I wanted to just, for clarity, for whoever is listening, there's no doubt that, of course, we're going to come back to have another joint committee session to finalize a lot of the work that everybody has been putting into all of this. I do believe that in the last joint session we'd have a conversation about Councilmember Albornoz's proposal to have this additional, pot of money. And I think it is, of course, important for us to be very clear about what the current process is going to be. But the bill was going to establish a lot of those parameters. And we did attempt, I remember during, for example, the recession, we did establish some guidelines. And it had to do with the safety net, prioritizing safety net services. So, we have in the past established particular policy goals or areas. And I mean, it's always been a little bit of a dance with the executive because we had these two separate processes. I anticipate that as we come back to have this joint session that, we will definitely be able to particularly establish how it is that the council is going to have that input. I don't think it's fair to just, say, hey, county executive, you have these priorities and this is what we're going to do, because this is a partnership. So I believe that we're going to have ample time to specifically establish that, the mechanism through which we would be able to set forth the priorities. I think it's a great thing that, there's been some, deliberate processes looking at what the organizations are doing, how is this meeting the goals. We oftentimes talk about how the county has changed so much, and perhaps we have a lot of government services that have not been necessarily evaluated to see if they meet the Montgomery County needs of 2020. But also, we need to look at the dollars and the services that are being provided by our community partners, just to make sure that it's meeting, those particular needs as well, and if there are any tweaks that need to happen. So I don't think this is about filtering out anybody, but it's also just a good opportunity for a check-in. So anyway, I think that we're on track. Councilmember Albornoz obviously has had a lot of hands-on experience about this in terms of how it's been done before, and I really look forward to the March 5th joint session for us to be able to finalize sort of how we're going to do this moving forward. And any transition is tough, but I feel 100% convinced that we need to do this for clarity for our nonprofit partners, but also for us to make sure that we can leverage the dollars that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you. I think that was a really good overview. I appreciate Councilor Friedson's questions. I certainly understand where he's coming from on a lot of different levels, and I've heard some of the concern, particularly early on in this process as we were trying to figure out what this transition looked like from our nonprofit sector. I do want to commend Carolyn, Rafael, and Josh, because I think you guys have done a good job in engaging our nonprofit community on a number of different levels. Mr. Waters, you and I have served on a couple of boards together, and I really appreciate the way that you have very clearly identified and defined sort of what this process needs to look like from in representing the executive branch. And I do agree fundamentally with this shift. I mean, this moves us, no question, in a much better direction with more transparency. And that session on March 5th will be important because it will be an opportunity for us to round out some of the details with regards to what this grant office is going to look like, what the objectives will be, how specifically the council will be involved in decision making, because it is important for this body. One of the greatest things about this first year in public office has been appreciating what a unique perch the county council has in looking at all sectors, transportation, education, the environment, our arts and humanities community, and the ability to connect dots uniquely has been really fascinating and the part that I've loved most about this job. And so this body does have a lot to offer in the way of suggestions, recommendations on systemic building in particular, and where the identifications are of some of the holes in programming that are out there that we see and experience through constituent services and our work on the dais. So I think we're heading in the right direction. I guess, obviously, it's yet to be determined exactly what process we're going to follow, hoping that there is this potential new pot of money that we can draw from, and that will obviously be important. I did want to stress in conversations that I've had with the executive branch with regards to renewals that organizations who are not performing probably won't be surprised because there has been information and there has been discussion all along the way. If there's an issue, it's pretty much already been identified. So to our friends and colleagues in the nonprofit sector who do such incredible work every day, I want to allay some of the concerns I've heard with regards to those renewals that unless there's some very clear issue, that renewals will be likely as they have been in the past. And so I just wanted to confirm that. I guess I'm seeing you nod your head, Mr. Waters, but if you could state that, that would be great.
Sure, and as you clearly said, unless there's a clear issue, say an organization is no longer in good standing with the state, meaning they cannot enter into a contractual obligation with the county, that's an example of why perhaps why an organization's grant would not be renewed, because we can't engage into a contract with them.
Right.
It's just an example.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for now. We'll go through the rest of the packet, but might have some other comments as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know we still have more of the packet to go through, but since everyone's asking questions, I'll just ask this very timely question. I appreciate everyone else's forward-looking questions as what this means moving forward, what it means in the next few years as the various iterations continue to evolve. But let me just ask more immediately. The grants process closed last week. How did that go? The grant application process, to be specific, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. So we had 330 applications for program renewals. Of the 330 applications for renewals, 202 applied for enhancement funding, so an expansion of their existing programs, what they wanted to do, basically asking for additional money on top of what they've received in the past. We had 174 applications for new programs, and so those are coming from existing organizations that already get money from the county council, county executive, and they want to do a different or a new program on top of what they already do. And that also includes new organizations who are applying for county money for the first time. We have 52 applications for capital programs. We have not had a chance to go through those yet in terms of the total amount that's been requested because those are submitted in PDF format. But in terms of the total amount being requested by the nonprofit community, just for program renewals with the 3-year look back, we've got $16,445,000 has been requested just for renewals. And that's higher than the $14.5 million given last year because we're looking back 3 years. So if an organization got $50,000 in FY18 and then they got, let's say, $25,000 in FY20, they probably applied for the $50,000 because the highest level they received money for in the last 3 years. So the enhancements, nonprofit partners asked for additional $9.5 million of additional funding on top of what they had been renewed for those existing programs. And then for new programs, we had $9.8 million requested on top of the existing programs. And so those are the top line figures.
A lot of good top-line figures, and that conforms with the trend lines that people continue applying and continue asking, organizations continue asking for more funds to expand their programs. But the top-line statement I would make is that there doesn't seem to have been any problems with people and organizations submitting their grant applications. Or is that not a correct statement?
I think generally that's correct. When comparing to last year's numbers, we've actually seen an increase in the number of applications received. Last year, I think there were 506 applications, including some duplications, so that number comes down a little bit. And this year we have 556. So we received about 50 more applications this year than we did last year, which was the high water mark for number of applications received.
And while we wade through the important conversation of how we move forward, I think this setting the baseline for where we are now is important to know that the organizations are participating, are requesting, and now that they're in the door, we have these important conversations of how to move them through. So thank you.
I think another point to, and I know you don't have this chart in front of you, but the total ask without capital programs is $35.7 million. That is in line in the last 3 years that I've been here in terms of your maximum market. So we're not talking about a $90 million market of nonprofit community partners. We open the application to apply for your renewal, but apply for as much as you need to run your program, plus any program can apply. We had no caps on it. With that, and just initially, we're talking about a $35 million total ask, which means I think we have saturated the nonprofit market, which is what we said last year too. The amounts don't go up that much. Instead, what we're going to see is growth in new programs and new organizations, which is why separating out that 175 program number is important, and we'll focus on that jointly after March.
Thank you. You want to lead us through the packet? How are you going to handle this?
Sure. If you want to go, actually, I wanted to finish your fourth question.
Okay.
Okay, so your fourth question was on the allocation for new programs.
Yep.
New programs fund. So the discussions that came in the beginning were about actually first, do we just determine an amount of funds that we can allocate due to spending affordability guidelines? That discussion happened early, starting in July and October, and the The recommendation was not to put a number around it because we have no data backing up what that scope is. Without getting the information of every single program that's applying, no matter what your program is, that $174 and $9 million ask, from that we can then suss down on what the actual need is for new and innovative programs. And to remember that the purpose of these grants from the beginning was to be 1-year pilot funds or startup for programs so that we could test out an idea that was innovative for 12 months. So I think we have a good start in terms of organizing the data correctly to then take that $9 million and say what's affordable this year and what's affordable going forward.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I just want quickly on this point, I understand that I guess the conversations had happened in the summer. I was not aware of any of those conversations. I don't know if any of my colleagues were aware of any of those conversations. There was a process that the number was used from the previous year's allocation that started the spending affordability guidelines. At least that's the first process that I participated in. And I think it just speaks to the broader question of what the council's involvement is going to be moving forward. And so I would just request that if conversations like that, which I see as a policy question, a substantive policy question, that the council be informed of that in either a casual polling of council members to make sure that everybody is aware and on board, or a formal conversation during a joint committee session or a full council session so that we can make those decisions ourselves. Because I'm not saying I necessarily disagree with that decision. It's logical, but it was not one that I was aware of, and I raised it when the packet came out asking about the spending affordability guidelines, and that's where I realized that it had taken place unbeknownst to me, and I think to most, if not all, of my colleagues.
I agree 100% with you. The timing of the December and January timing of the launch of the application, as well as the documentation of the FY21 community grants process from OMB, put us in a crunch timeline where we had 4 days before the holidays and we had to decide whether to launch then or launch in January. So I agree with you. From now on, I think we can all confirm that we will schedule joint work sessions or full council updates, whether it's just a memo that we don't necessarily have to discuss on, but a memo coming directly from the joint review staff to you so that you're updated on the decisions that are made.
Carolyn, just to be clear, when the original purpose for the grants was supposed to be for 1 year and not for new innovative programs. That was when we first started talking about this, I think. Am I incorrect on that?
You mean 12 years ago?
No, I mean
okay.
Now. Yeah, and 12 years ago, yeah.
Oh.
And the original?
In the original, it was for 1 year contracts. Yes, to fill gaps for that year. So it was a community-based approach of allowing the community to tell the council on what's missing. After the year has gone by, you have the community can apply and say, you're missing this community, we can provide this service. So it was the idea to be able, every year, to be able to fill those gaps in depending on what the priority was.
And so are we saying now that the new purpose is to help pilot new and innovative programs?
No, we're not saying that. We haven't decided the process yet. And I think what's important is that we had to split it up because of timing of contracts. There's been no decision on what the priority is on the new programs or the innovative programs. The reason why those words come out so quickly is because if you see the new applications that come in, they're all new, and the new ones are very different and innovative, but that's just an understanding of what we've been able to read. But in terms of filling gaps, we should be prioritizing that on the renewals and the program enhancements first, right? So these new innovative programs, we have to define innovative. We can create a rubric and a criteria for that, like we're doing for the capital grants. That's not a problem, and that would be with full council input.
Because obviously, I don't think I'm just speaking for myself. I think we're all concerned, and I think for many years we felt that the nonprofit community, which does the fine work for Montgomery County and does the work the Montgomery County government can't do, and does it better than Montgomery County if we did do it, that we've treated them that they have to sit in the audience, on whatever day we're talking about, what day that the grants are approved. They have to sit in the audience, have no idea how much they're going to get, and can't plan anything beyond. And that's no way to treat the partners that you want to keep in business. So we need to change all of that, and then we have to figure out what's the best way to get there. Anyhow, we should go through this packet, or however we want to do it.
There are questions on the fourth question on new allocation? Okay, great. So if we can just, it's not going to go through in detail, but just so you understand a little bit about the timeline, there is a grant Gantt chart. Hold on. Somewhere. It's a colored chart somewhere. Circle 1, okay.
Circle 1.
Circle 1, all right. Hopefully you got this in color. So this is a...
Ours is not. But,
okay.
Yours is much prettier.
It's much prettier, I hope so. So this is our projected timeline for 2021. We're moving to, if you remember from past of grants 1.0 to 1.2 to 2.0 to 3.0. This is more detailed on each of the roles and responsibilities of each branch. There in blue is strictly only county executive. You'll see most of everything is in green, which is county executive and county council is in yellow. You can't see that. Oh.
We don't.
All right, I dropped it off with your...
Yeah, they just handed me one from my staff, but...
Awesome, okay.
What? Yeah. I agree. We have great staff, and Han Dreamer said that, and I agree with him.
Yes,
anyhow,
great staff.
So we will make certain that everybody gets a copy of it in color. It's much easier to read.
Yes, but the highlight is we've got 19, 20, 20, 20, 20 first half, 20 after the vote, and 21 mapped out. And the idea is that we will revise this as the process goes on. This is just to understand that there are there's different decision-making processes happening here, just the executive branch, just the county council, and that most of the FY21 community grants is done jointly.
Which is fine, because if it's not in color, you can't tell what this chart's saying at all. Yeah, thanks.
Any questions on that other than we'll get you a color version?
Okay. Go ahead.
Right. So moving forward, we have received all the applications that have been submitted last Wednesday. We had a top line in terms of the economic or the ask, the financial ask. Through this discussion, we will provide any information that we have on the list of renewals that have been applied, as well as their enhancements, as well as the new programs up front, and then we'll summarize the maximum amount of financial and fiscal impact that could be needed in community grants NDA. Any questions on that? And then March 5th, so this will be done in February. You'll get all of this information in February. All legislative analysts on central staff will also get this information in their portfolios. And on March 5th, we'll be discussing the Office of Grants Management on whether or not we should move forward or what that would be like to be structured. And then the county executive will have the recommended grants that should only have renewals in them, and then we will have a chance to weigh in on all the new programs and program enhancements of all the rest of the applications. Any questions on timeline?
Nope. Go ahead. Anything else? Is there anything
No,
else?
not on us. We didn't have any particular decision points we needed today, and there's no vote or decision. It was just an update. So unless OMB has anything else to say, I think we're set here.
Okay. Any questions from here? Councilmember, I knew this was going to happen. Councilmember Friedson, please.
I'm just curious, the committee chairs noted earlier that we might be coming back to make some decision points. Are there no decision points that we're going to be making on this interim process? Are we going to be making decision points for the next fiscal year? Are the decision points only going to be made during the budget process, because now we're effectively either moving things into the base or not moving things into the base, and then having a separate pot of money for new programs, and that amount and pot of money is to be determined, I presume, by the county executive and to be submitted on March 16th? I mean, it's not clear to me exactly where we stand now, and I don't know if it's clear to others, so if you could share that, please.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so we're going to come back on March 15th for the joint committees to March 5th for to finalize the bill, which has not only the establishment of the grants office, but also will be
FY22
determining quite a
process.
lot of specifics in terms of what happens after this next fiscal year. I mean, I am operating under that assumption
Yes.
as chair of GO with the chair of HHS and committee members, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I
that's
think
what we
that's correct.
said that we were going to do. So I thought that this briefing was about what's going to
21.
happen
Yeah.
with this fiscal year that we're about to engage. But when we come together as joint committee, we will definitely be making some decisions. And so, you know, any observations or any kind of, you know, specific things, let's come together on March 5th to iron those out and then decide. And that would be then for the long-term approach that we will take.
I think what's also important from this session to take away is that we need the information earlier in order to inform our discussion on March 5th, which is why I'm glad it got rescheduled, our session, so that we can collect more information on this current FY21 process, the program areas and organizations that applied, the new and innovative programs, or just fill in the gap programs. So you have that information, and everyone will have that information prior to the discussion of how to shape 22. We never had that information before. So I
Right.
feel like it's important to spend February in order to have that. I would request, and I've requested from OMB 2 items. One, to get the additional the preliminary base budget decisions criteria as well as department decisions, and second, the last 3 years of federal and state grant funds that have come by department. And
That is so
that's already been-
important because we're not going to be able to do our work if we don't have all that information in a timely fashion. And then it's not fair for our nonprofit partners to
That's the
be,
key.
you know, to be in this situation. So it would be really critical for, you know, OMB to have that information ready. You know, we did reschedule it, but obviously we don't want to be in a situation where we have to reschedule again because that just keeps everybody guessing, and that's not the way we want to do our work. So to the extent that we can, you know, get all that together, really appreciate that.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Thanks for that clarification. I was only under the impression that we were discussing the bill and the creation of the office, and it's really helpful to know that we'll be discussing the process for moving forward in the context of that, which makes a lot of sense. And so I really appreciate that clarification. It puts me a little bit at ease on this. Just a couple of last questions, and then promise I'm done on the process now. One, we talked about a lot of things here today, a lot of process and decision points that have to be made, not necessarily policy questions, but operational questions. Do we think it's feasible that all of those decisions are going to be made on the renewals, working with the departments, making those determinations in a month, which, you know, before the need for the March 16th submission to the council? I mean, is that definitely on pace and going to happen within the time frame that we currently have?
Yes, it should be on pace.
Okay, great. And then last question, based on determining whether things make it into the base budget, the renewals, it sounds like the confirmation that unless there are serious issues, at least for this year, that, you know, organizations will be renewed. What about the question that was raised about the Arts and Humanities Council? I see Susan Jenkins is here in the back of the room, but you know, we've had certain circumstances where there's questions about whether and where organizations should be funded. Is that going to be determined this year, or is that going to start next year? Could you just clarify that? Because I've had a lot of questions raised by organizations about that particular question. And I'll be honest, there are some organizations where you can make a reasonable argument for it being an arts organization or a community grants eligible organization. And so it'd be helpful to clarify.
So for arts and humanity organizations, which have historically been ineligible to apply for community grants, the problem with that is that we didn't enforce that. And so over the years, we have increased the amount of funds that have been given to arts and humanities organizations through the community grant process, in addition to the funds that are available through the Arts and Humanities Council. What we're doing this year is to quantify that information. Actually, last year I presented the amount of funds, $750,000 that were given to arts humanities organizations through community grants. We're going to do the same thing this year, quantify that number, which then helps us determine what the need is. Organizations are applying for community grants because there's not enough funds in the Arts and Humanities Council in order to fund what they need. And so the idea here is not to shut out organizations, but to identify the need. On top of it, we're splitting out the capital grant grant process, which has historically not been very clear. We've moved up the capital grant process to January, where we get all the information on every organization, arts or not, in order to follow the state legislative body vote. With that said, are we making this decision this year or the next year? It depends on need. If you have millions of dollars of ask coming from that 35 million coming from ARCS organizations, we need to have a larger discussion on what the need is in the arts community versus the Community Grants and Health and Human Services Committee. If it is just a misallocation of, we can move resources from Community Grants to Arts Humanities Council to address that need, that's what we're trying to do this year.
I appreciate that. It would be helpful just to know, and I just want to set the expectation that those organizations that fall into that category also be held harmless, and if we need to figure out a way to fund it in this interim year while we transition so that no organizations are hurt based on the change that we make, similar to the way that we're doing the look back for all organizations. I hope that that expectation is broader, and then obviously there could be a fiscal implication to the Arts and Humanities Council, and so we need to address that through that broader context, and I hope that's a decision point that the council can make perhaps at the March meeting. And I will say the capital grants process, just from my look as I've been working through these issues, seems to be much clearer, much easier, and much better. And so I want to close by thanking you for those changes. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from organizations for that, and I have looked at the different applications and the different information, and that just seems to be a much cleaner and easier process. So thank you for working that out, and thank you for all the work that everybody has done on this and all the attention that my colleagues and the Joint Committee chairs have brought forward for this, and to the Council President as well. Thanks.
Thank
One
you.
more point. Can I just stop? On the, not only are we not trying to hurt any organization in terms of funding or programs they provide, I'd like to also focus the discussion on March 5th on all council members and OMB that this is not a discussion on just grants. That's $17 million. We're talking about the actual capacity of departments at right now is $119 million to contract out with nonprofits. The goal of that office is not to manage a $15 million process. It's to increase capacity of the departments, double the $119 million. So if we can also think of much larger numbers and larger impact, that would help, I think, structure the bill on March 5th.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
I just want to underscore something that Councilmember Navarro said with regards to alignment with state funding. A real example of that is Excel Beyond the Bell. The governor decided not to fund that program and had other priorities, and so it was the council that had to weigh in quickly to fill a very significant hole for a very important program. The other thing, obviously, we're all hoping that there is this additional pot of money that is in the county executive's recommended operating budget, and we'll have to move quickly to process that and ensure we're all on the same page with regards to how that is spent and allocated. So as we look at the scheduling calendar, aligning multiple committees is often challenging, but obviously that'll need to be a priority as close to March 16th as we can make it. So to everyone's point, the various organizations have enough time to prepare if and when they are to receive some additional funds. So thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. I don't see any other questions, so thank you for being here, and we obviously continue our work together. We will be back at 1:30. We're going to, before we adjourn, let me just say that we will be back at 1:30 for a public hearings, and we're going to have a public hearing, and then we're going to have a work session on Forest Glen / Montgomery Hill sector plan. Thank you very much. See you in a couple hours.